Flashing sirens in the dead of night usually mean safety, but for one terrified woman, they signaled pure nightmare fuel when one corrupt officer played God on this lonely highway. He thought she was just helpless prey. He didn't know her husband was his ultimate boss, watching every move unfold. The dashboard clock of the 2024 Range Rover read 1:15 a.m. Outside, the biting November wind whipped fallen leaves across the desolate stretch of Route 114. Sarah Jenkins kept her hands strictly at 10 and 2 on the leather steering wheel, her eyes focused on the winding road leading into the affluent, heavily manicured suburb of Cresthaven. Sarah, a 34-year-old corporate attorney, was used to late nights. She had just wrapped up a grueling 3-day merger negotiation in the city and was finally heading home. The heated seats and the quiet hum of the luxury SUV's engine were the only comforts keeping her awake. In the passenger seat beside her, completely obscured by the heavy factory tint of the windows, lay her husband, David. David Jenkins was dead to the world. He had reclined the passenger seat as far back as it could go, a heavy wool blanket pulled up to his chin, his face hidden beneath the pulled-down brim of a faded Boston College baseball cap. David had every reason to be exhausted. Just 3 days prior, he had been sworn in as the new chief of police for the Cresthaven Police Department. Brought in directly from a high-ranking deputy commissioner role in Boston, David had been headhunted by the town council for one specific reason. Cresthaven PD was drowning in civil rights lawsuits, racial profiling complaints, and a toxic brotherhood culture that the previous chief had actively protected. David was hired to be the cleansing fire, but tonight he wasn't the chief. He was just a desperately tired husband who had insisted on riding into the city to keep his wife company on her late drive back. As Sarah crested the hill near the town line, a familiar, sickening flash of red and blue lights ignited in her rearview mirror. Sarah's stomach dropped. It was an instinctual, physiological reaction she had never been able to train out of herself, despite her law degree and pristine record. She glanced at her speedometer. She was going 42 in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. She hadn't swerved. Her registration was current. Her taillights were perfectly functional. "Damn it," she whispered under her breath, easing her foot off the accelerator. She activated her turn signal and carefully guided the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder, parking under the pale, flickering light of a lone street lamp. She shifted into park, turned off the engine, turned on the interior dome light, and immediately placed both of her hands flat on top of the steering wheel. She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't reach for the glove compartment. She knew the unwritten rules of surviving a traffic stop as a black woman in a town like Cresthaven. In the passenger seat, David let out a soft, rhythmic snore. The engine's silence hadn't been enough to wake him from his deep slumber. Behind her, the police cruiser's doors opened. Out stepped Officer Brian Dugan. Dugan was a 12-year veteran of the Cresthaven force, a heavily built man with a tightly shaved head and a reputation for being aggressively proactive. To his union rep, he was a go-getter. To the citizens of color who passed through Cresthaven, he was a relentless predator. He had 14 excessive force complaints in his personnel file, all of which had been miraculously dismissed or buried by internal affairs. Walking alongside Dugan was Officer Matthew Collins, a 23-year-old rookie barely 6 months out of the academy. Collins hung back near the rear bumper of Sarah's SUV, his hand nervously resting on his duty belt, watching his senior officer take the lead. Dugan approached the driver's side window. He didn't walk with the cautious professional stride of an officer conducting a routine stop. He swaggered, his heavy boots crunching the gravel. He unclipped his high-lumen tactical flashlight and shined the blinding, concentrated beam directly through the driver's side glass, scanning the interior. Because of the angle and the pitch-black tint of the rear windows, Dugan's light completely missed the fully reclined passenger seat. All he saw was a lone black woman in a $100,000 vehicle. Sarah rolled the window down exactly 3 inches. "Good evening, officer," Sarah said, her voice steady, modulated to project absolute calm. "Is there a problem?" "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Dugan barked, ignoring her greeting. He kept the blinding flashlight pointed directly at her eyes, making it impossible for her to see his face clearly. "They are in my purse, which is on the floorboard behind my seat, and the registration is in the glove box," Sarah said slowly, narrating her movements exactly as her father had taught her decades ago. "I am going to reach for my purse now. Is that okay?" "Just get the documents," Dugan snapped, his tone dripping with impatience and a subtle, unmistakable layer of contempt. Sarah carefully twisted her torso, keeping one hand on the wheel while the other retrieved her designer handbag. She pulled out her leather wallet, extracted her driver's license and insurance card, and then reached across the console to pop the glove box for the registration. As the glove box clicked open, the sudden noise caused David to stir. He shifted slightly under his blanket, cracking one eye open. The harsh glare of the flashlight bouncing off the interior woke him up, but years of undercover and tactical experience kicked in instantly. Before his brain had fully processed the situation, his instincts told him to remain perfectly still. David silently assessed the scene. He saw his wife handing over her documents through a narrow crack in the window. He heard the aggressive, dismissive tone of the officer outside. As the new chief, David had spent the last 72 hours reading the personnel files of his new department. He had memorized the names of the problem children. He knew exactly who was working the midnight shift in this sector. Officer Brian Dugan, David thought, his jaw clenching beneath the blanket. David could have sat up right then. He could have rolled down the window, flashed his gold chief's badge, and ended the stop immediately. But as he listened to Dugan's heavy breathing outside the window, a different thought crossed his mind. The town council had hired him to root out the rot. He had been looking for an undeniable, ironclad reason to terminate the officers who were terrorizing the public. Right now, he wasn't Chief Jenkins. He was a ghost in the passenger seat. And he was going to see exactly how Officer Brian Dugan treated a citizen when he thought nobody of importance was watching. David reached his hand out beneath the blanket and gently, invisibly, squeezed Sarah's thigh. Sarah flinched slightly at the touch, but she immediately understood the signal. Let him dig his own grave. Dugan snatched the laminated cards from Sarah's fingers, pulling them out through the narrow gap in the window. He shined his flashlight onto the license. "Sarah Jenkins," Dugan read aloud, butchering the pronunciation of her first name with a mocking drawl. "You a long way from home, Sarah? This address says the Heights. That's a pretty expensive neighborhood for someone who looks like you." Sarah maintained a neutral expression, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I live in Cresthaven Heights, officer. I'm on my way home from work." "Work?" Dugan scoffed, shining the light around the pristine interior of the SUV again. "What kind of work pays for a brand-new Range Rover? Whose car is this, really?" "It is my vehicle," Sarah replied, her loyally precision bleeding into her tone. "The registration you are holding confirms that. Now, if you could tell me why you pulled me over." "I'll ask the questions here," Dugan snapped, stepping closer so that his utility belt scraped against the driver's side door. "You were swerving back there, Crossing the yellow line. You been drinking tonight, Sarah? Smoking a little something to take the edge off? I haven't consumed any alcohol or drugs, Sarah stated firmly, and I was driving perfectly straight. That's funny, because my eyes tell a different story, and I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle. Dugan lied smoothly. It was the oldest trick in the book, the magic phrase that gave corrupt cops instant probable cause to tear a car apart. In the rear, Officer Collins shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He hadn't seen the SUV swerve either, and as he stood near the exhaust pipe, all he smelled was the crisp November air. "Hey, Brian," Collins mumbled hesitantly over the radio mic clipped to his shoulder. "Everything good up there? Dispatch wants our status." "Tell Dispatch we're conducting a DUI investigation," Dugan called back over his shoulder. He turned his attention back to Sarah. "Roll the window all the way down and step out of the vehicle." Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The cold air rushing through the 3-inch gap suddenly felt freezing. "Officer, with all due respect, I am not stepping out of this car on a dark highway at 1 in the morning without a valid reason. I have given you my identification. Issue a citation if you feel I committed a traffic violation, but I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." Dugan's face turned an ugly shade of red. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black woman who used big words and looked at him without an ounce of fear. His ego, fragile and easily bruised, instantly hijacked his judgment. "Listen to me very carefully, you arrogant bitch," Dugan hissed, dropping all pretenses of professional courtesy. His voice dropped to a menacing growl that wouldn't be picked up by his cruiser's dashcam microphone. "I'm giving you a lawful order. You either step out of this car right now, or I smash this window, drag you out by your hair, and arrest you for resisting a peace officer. Do you understand me?" Beneath the blanket, David's blood turned to ice. Every muscle in his body tightened, his heart thudding violently in his chest. It took every ounce of his extensive training to keep from kicking the door open and throwing Dugan onto the asphalt, but he needed the trap to snap shut completely. He needed Dugan to cross the point of no return. "Officer," Sarah said, her voice shaking just a fraction, projecting the genuine terror that the situation warranted. "Please call your supervisor to the scene. I am requesting a supervisor." "I am the senior officer on this shift," Dugan shouted, banging his heavy metal flashlight against the glass of the window, leaving a visible scratch on the reinforced pane. "Step out of the damn car." Collins took a step forward, his voice cracking with anxiety. "Dugan, man, maybe we should just write the ticket and—" "Shut up, rookie. Secure the perimeter," Dugan barked, completely unhinged now. He reached his thick fingers into the 3-inch gap of the window, attempting to blindly grasp the interior door handle to force it open from the inside. "Do not reach into my vehicle," Sarah yelled, leaning back against the center console to avoid his grasping hand. "You're done! You are done!" Dugan roared. He pulled his arm back and unholstered his taser, the bright yellow plastic gleaming ominously in the dark. He pointed the laser sight directly at Sarah's chest through the glass. "Unlock the door right now, or you're getting lit up!" The mechanical click of the taser being armed echoed loudly in the confined space of the SUV. That was it. The line had been crossed, obliterated, and left in the dust. Slowly, deliberately, the heavy wool blanket in the passenger seat slid downward. David Jenkins sat up. He didn't make a sudden movement. He didn't shout. He simply pressed the button on his door panel, lowering the passenger side window, and reached up to turn the interior cabin lights to maximum brightness. The sudden illumination flooded the inside of the SUV, revealing the imposing, broad-shouldered figure of the man in the passenger seat. David removed the faded baseball cap, revealing his sharply trimmed hair and the unmistakable authoritative glare of a man who commanded thousands of officers. Dugan, still pointing the taser at Sarah, caught the movement in his peripheral vision. He instantly whipped his head toward the passenger side, expecting to see a hidden threat, a boyfriend, someone he could easily intimidate or charge as an accomplice. Instead, Dugan found himself staring directly into the soiled, unblinking eyes of David Jenkins. Dugan's breath caught in his throat. His brain misfired, struggling to process the face in front of him. He had just seen this exact face plastered on the front page of the Cresthaven Chronicle that morning. He had seen this face on the departmental memo sent to every precinct just 8 hours ago. It was the new chief of police. The silence that fell over Route 114 was deafening. The wind seemed to stop howling. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic idling of the police cruiser behind them. David stared at the corrupt officer for 5 agonizing seconds. He didn't break eye contact as he reached into his sweatpants pocket, pulled out a gold metal badge nestled in a black leather wallet, and pressed it flat against the glass of the windshield. "Officer Dugan," David said, his voice dangerously low, cutting through the cold night air like a scalpel. "You have exactly 3 seconds to holster that weapon, step away from my wife's vehicle, and stand at attention." Dugan's hand trembled so violently that the red laser sight of the taser danced erratically across the interior ceiling of the SUV. The aggressive, chest-thumping predator from 3 seconds ago had vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, sweating man staring into the terrifying abyss of his own ruined career. He slowly lowered the weapon, the bright yellow plastic suddenly looking absurd and heavy in his grip. He slid it back into his holster, his fingers fumbling clumsily with the retention strap. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. But the cold November wind stole whatever pathetic excuse he was trying to formulate. Chief Jenkins pushed the heavy door of the Range Rover open. He didn't rush. He stepped out onto the gravel shoulder with the calculated, terrifying calmness of an apex predator. Standing at 6'3", even dressed in casual sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt, the chief projected an aura of absolute, crushing authority. He walked around the hood of the vehicle, his bare hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes locked onto the corrupt patrolman. "Officer Collins!" Jenkins called out, his voice echoing over the rhythmic hum of the idling police cruiser. Near the rear bumper, the rookie flinched as if he had been physically struck. Yes, sir, Chief," Collins stammered, his posture snapping rigidly straight. "Step forward and relieve your senior officer of his duty belt," Jenkins ordered, his tone flat and leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Secure his weapons, his radio, and his keys in the trunk of your cruiser." Dugan's eyes widened in sheer panic. He took a half-step backward, raising his hands defensively. "Chief, hold on. Wait a minute. You've got this all wrong. It's dark out here. I didn't see you in the car, I swear. I thought she was—" "You thought she was exactly what you wanted her to be," Jenkins interrupted, stepping directly into Dugan's personal space. The height difference forced the patrolman to look up, exposing his throat. "An easy target. A victim without a voice. You didn't know the chief of police was sitting in the passenger seat, Dugan. But that is the entire point, isn't it? You thought nobody of consequence was watching. You thought your badge gave you a license to terrorize." Sarah Jenkins had finally rolled her window down completely. She watched the exchange with a mixture of residual adrenaline and profound satisfaction. Her hands were no longer shaking. "Sir, she was swerving," Dugan lied, his voice cracking desperately as he tried to cling to his fabricated probable cause. "I smelled narcotics. I was just following standard investigative procedure for a suspected DUI." "You are a liar," Jenkins stated coldly. "My wife has not had a drop of alcohol, nor has she touched a narcotic. She was driving 42 in a 45 zone, maintaining a perfect lane. I know this because I was awake for the last 3 miles, observing your patrol car tailing us with your headlights turned off, waiting for the jurisdictional line to make your move." Collins stepped up tentatively, his hands trembling as he reached for Dugan's belt buckle. "Brian, man, just give it to me," the rookie whispered pleadingly. "Don't make this worse." Dugan looked at the rookie, then back at the chief. The fight completely drained out of him. He unbuckled the heavy leather rig, handing over his Glock, his taser, his pepper spray, and his handcuffs. He stood on the side of the highway, suddenly looking incredibly small and powerless in his oversized uniform. Jenkins reached into his pocket, pulled out his own cell phone, and dialed a number. He put it on speakerphone, holding it up so Dugan could hear every word. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1. Chief Jenkins." He spoke into the receiver. "Go ahead, Chief." The dispatcher's confused voice crackled through the phone. "Contact Lieutenant Gregory Harrison. Tell him to get out of bed, put his uniform on, and meet me at the Route 114 town line immediately. Also, wake up Captain Valerie Hayes from Internal Affairs. Tell her to meet us at the precinct. I have an officer in custody." Dugan's knees nearly buckled. "In custody? Chief, please! You can't arrest me for a bad traffic stop. I have a family. The Union won't stand for this." "The Union," Jenkins replied smoothly, hanging up the phone, "cannot protect you from a federal civil rights violation, Officer Dugan. You threatened to drag a compliant citizen out of her vehicle by her hair. You aimed a deadly weapon at an unarmed woman who provided you with all requested documentation. You fabricated probable cause on a recorded dashcam line." Jenkins leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately. Get in the back of your own cruiser. You're done." Defeated, humiliated, and stripped of the armor he had hidden behind for 12 years, Brian Dugan walked slowly to the rear door of his own patrol car. Officer Collins opened the door, a look of utter disbelief etched across his young face, and watched his training officer slide into the plastic-molded back seat reserved for criminals. The fallout the next morning was swift, brutal, and entirely unprecedented in the quiet, wealthy enclave of Cresthaven. By 8 a.m., the local precinct was a swarm of frantic activity. Word had spread through the locker room like wildfire. The untouchable Brian Dugan was sitting in an interrogation room, unrepresented, waiting for a union lawyer who was stubbornly refusing to return his calls. Chief Jenkins sat in his newly furnished office, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. Across the desk sat Captain Valerie Hayes, the head of Internal Affairs. For years, Hayes had been deliberately defunded and ignored by the previous administration. Today, she looked like a woman who had finally been given a loaded weapon to hunt with. "We tossed his cruiser, his locker, and executed a search warrant on his personal vehicle," Captain Hayes said, dropping a thick, leather-bound notebook and a cheap disposable cell phone onto the chief's desk. "You were right to trust your instincts, Chief. He wasn't just acting on racist impulses. He was running a fully operational extortion racket." Jenkins set his coffee down, his eyes narrowing as he pulled the notebook toward him. "Explain." "Dugan was exploiting civil asset forfeiture loopholes," Hayes explained, her finger tapping the cover of the ledger. "He specifically targeted high-end luxury vehicles driven by minorities with out-of-town license plates. He'd pull them over on Route 114 late at night, fabricate a marijuana smell to bypass the need for a search warrant, and tear the cars apart." Jenkins flipped through the pages, seeing dates, license plate numbers, and dollar amounts meticulously recorded. He was stealing their cash. Exactly, Hayes nodded grimly. If he found large amounts of cash, say, a contractor carrying payroll or someone traveling to buy a used car, he would seize it under the suspicion of drug trafficking. He'd tell the drivers that if they signed a waiver surrendering the money, he wouldn't arrest them or tow their cars. Terrified, out of their jurisdiction, and facing an aggressive cop with a gun, almost all of them signed. Jenkins felt a cold fury settling deep in his chest. Where did the money go? It never hit the evidence locker. He was splitting it with William Miller, the owner of Miller Towing, Hayes said. If someone refused to sign the waiver, Dugan called Miller to impound the car. Miller would charge exorbitant release fees and kick half back to Dugan. We checked the burner phone. Hundreds of texts between them coordinating stops. The door to the office clicked open. Sarah Jenkins stepped inside, dressed impeccably in a sharp navy blue suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. She wasn't here as a terrified victim. She was here as a highly educated corporate litigator who specialized in forensic accounting. I took the liberty of running background checks on the last 50 names listed in that ledger, Sarah said smoothly, taking a seat next to Captain Hayes. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly organized spreadsheets. 32 of them were small business owners passing through the state. I've already contacted 6 of them this morning. They are all willing to testify. Jenkins looked at his wife, a deep sense of pride warring with the lingering anger from the night before. You've been busy. He threatened my life, and he threatened my dignity, Sarah replied, her voice cool and dangerously calm. I am going to help you dismantle every single piece of his life. I've already forwarded these findings to the State Attorney General's office, and I made a courtesy call to Agent Jonathan Pierce at the FBI field office in Boston. This crosses state lines. It's a federal racketeering case now. Within 48 hours, the Cresthaven Police Department was national news. But for once, it wasn't a story of a cover-up. It was a story of a house cleaning. Mayor Thomas Wentworth, desperate to save his own political career, held a joint press conference with Chief Jenkins, publicly denouncing Dugan's actions and fully endorsing the chief's zero-tolerance policy. The town's toxic brotherhood culture fractured immediately. Terrified of facing federal indictments, 3 other officers who had been tangentially involved in Dugan's towing scheme abruptly handed in their resignations. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a notoriously strict federal magistrate, denied Dugan bail, citing him as an extreme flight risk and a danger to the public. A month later, standing in a brightly lit federal courtroom, Brian Dugan looked nothing like the monster who had terrorized Route 114. Stripped of his badge, his gun, and his arrogant swagger, he wore an oversized orange jumpsuit and kept his eyes glued to the floor. Sarah Jenkins sat in the front row of the gallery, her posture perfect, watching as the judge handed down a 22-year sentence without the possibility of early parole. Justice in America was rarely swift, and it was rarely perfect. But on this specific day, in this specific courtroom, the scales had finally balanced. As they walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun, Chief Jenkins reached out and took his wife's hand. "You okay?" he asked softly. Sarah looked back at the imposing stone pillars of the courthouse, then up at the man who had promised to protect her and to protect the town. She squeezed his hand firmly. "I'm perfectly fine," Sarah smiled. "It's a beautiful day for a drive." Did this story of justice served keep you on the edge of your seat? The truth always comes to light, and corruption never wins against those brave enough to stand their ground. If you loved this dramatic real-life twist, make sure to hit that like button right